Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Number to call if you want to join the program, 888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. While you're calling in, let me just finish up on that piece by Melanie Phillips in the Daily Mail online, where she was a hardcore leftist, hardcore liberal, grew up that way, believed the entire mantra of the left. Then she began to see the devastating impact of the breakdown of the nuclear family and how liberal policies were contributing to that. So she began to write about that. She says this is what she learned. For me, the traditional family is sacred because it embodies the idea that there is something beyond the selfish individual. Now, remember, we talked about this yesterday with John Maynard Keynes, who was homosexual, had no kids, and worshipped hedonism, pleasure, sensual action, could care less about the next generation because he had no children. He had no reason to be concerned about the generation to come. And this self-centeredness, this worship at the altar of self, informed his economic policy. FDR believed it. That's where the Social Security and the gross expansion of government came from. Lyndon Johnson believed it. LBJ believed it. And that's where we got the war on poverty. We spent $19 trillion, got more poor people than ever. And that's where President Bush comes up with the bank bailout and President Obama comes up with this stimulus thing. It's all Keynesian. But it's all short-sighted, and it's based around hedonism and the worship of self. And she says, I learned that many single mothers did a heroic job, but it was the absence of the father that did such terrible damage to their children. And she talks about some research released in 1992 by 3 influential social scientists, impeccable left-wing credentials, and they concluded that children in fractured families tended to suffer more ill health, do less well at school, more likely to be unemployed, more prone to criminal behavior, and to repeat as adults the same cycle of unstable parenting. And she writes that instead of welcoming this analysis as identifying a real problem, the left turned on the authors, branding them as evil right-wingers for being against single mothers. And then she gets to the core of this thing at the end of the piece. That's what I read with Mike Gonzalez, that although they claim to be all about altruism, they're not. They're about narcissism. They fly under the banner of care for the poor, but they don't. It's all about themselves. It was increasingly clear that the left had lost the moral plot. It had embraced the doctrine that all lifestyles were equal. None could be deemed any better than the other. I was perplexed by this as I was as perplexed as I was appalled. I had been brought up to believe that the left stood for altruism rather than selfishness, community rather than individualism, self-discipline rather than the law of the jungle and survival of the fittest. Instead, society was worshiping at the shrine of the self, and this was causing a rising tide of juvenile distress, crime, emotional disturbance, educational and relationship failure. And so she says, look, the left is all about being tolerant and non-judgmental unless you're a conservative and unless you write about the importance of strengthening the family, and then they are all over you, will call you a Nazi and whatever else goes along with that. Her concluding line, the result is that there are 2 Britons, just like there are 2 Americas. The first adhering to decency, rationality, and duty to others, that's us. And the second characterized by hatred, rampant selfishness, and a terrifying repudiation of reason. That's the left in America. She says they repudiate reason because they can't make a rational argument for their policy positions, so they quickly resort to name-calling. 888-589-8840. Let's go to Kathy, Wallace, North Carolina.
Hey, Brian Fisher, enjoy your show.
Thank you.
Well, I think the left deceives themselves so perfectly because they are constantly changing the definition of words, just like the thing with them. This wasn't what I was going to talk about, but this is how they do it. Just like the word proselytizing and evangelism,
Mm-hmm.
they changed it in their minds to mean coercion, which
Yes.
is not what it means. But anyway, I called to find out if you ever found out the results of the court decisions for the Ramika family from Germany that was homeschooling the children. That I think it was you or somebody I talked to said that the United States was argued that they were not running from persecution in Germany because nobody in Germany was allowed to be homeschooled.
Yeah,
well,
so
that doesn't see.
there's yeah, and my latest information, Kathy, is that they are in the United States, but the Obama administration is still actively seeking to deport them, still trying to send them back home. And again, it's just absolutely bizarre. It would be like this is an exaggeration, but it illustrates the point. It would be like being in Nazi Germany in World War II, and a Jew wants to leave Nazi Germany to flee persecution and the concentration camps. And our president, our administration would say, well, you have no case for discrimination here. You're not being discriminated against because they're gassing every Jew they can find. They're treating you just like every other Jew in Germany, so you've got no discrimination complaint. That's exactly kind of the parallel, that we have here. So we'll keep abreast of that, Kathy, and if we get developments on the Ramike family, what happens with them, we will certainly pass that along. And, of course, that represents a threat to their God-given right to educate their children and bring them up as they see fit. Thanks for the call, Kathy. I appreciate that. And, the ban on homeschooling in Germany, a lot of people don't know this. It goes right back to Hitler, because Hitler understood that if you have children raised and trained by their parents, inculcating in them the faith of their parents, the values, he will lose control. They would no longer be little peons of the state. So I said, we cannot have any parents educating their own children. That's the job for the state. We want to own these kids. We want to indoctrinate them. We want to brainwash them. We want them to belong to us. That's exactly what Melissa Harris Perry, remember that quote I played for you, that soundbite, MSNBC? We got to get past this notion that kids belong to their parents. They don't. They belong to us. That was Hitler's philosophy. That's why no homeschooling could be permitted in Germany. Well, let's go to David, Tyler, Texas. David, welcome to Focal Point. What's on your mind?
Hey, Brian.
Hey.
Boy, that was an interesting article by Melanie Phillips. And
Well, it was, wasn't it?
I looked it up and read it myself. A non-Christian writing an article like that, it was tremendous. I sure appreciate you bringing this up because, there's a catastrophe going on in the church. It's called divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And women are leaving their husbands, and pastors are ignoring it. The church is not calling people to account. And, it's like any sport. You've got to start with the fundamentals, and the family is the fundamental building block of society and the church. And I'd love to see pastors really address this, especially the women who are leaving the marriages, because now that's 2/3 of the marriages are started by women. Divorces are started by women.
Well, and I've talked with Mike McManus. In fact, I'll probably have him back on this program before long. He's with an organization called Marriage Savers, and there are a couple of states now that are actually passing legislation to move away from no-fault divorce, which was an absolute disaster for the institution of marriage. Ronald Reagan was the first one to sign no-fault divorce into law in California, said it was the worst decision that he ever made. And I agree with you, David, that, I think we have to start in the church, and I completely agree with you. When you have an unbiblical divorce, now Jesus did permit divorce in cases of infidelity. He didn't mandate it. He didn't require disciples to divorce, but he said this is permissible because that represents such a violation of the covenant, marriage covenant, and the one flesh bond. So it's permissible. But if you have a Christian in a church who pursues divorce for non-biblical reasons, they decide they don't love the person anymore, they don't want to be married to them anymore, we got married for better or for worse, but he's worse than I thought, falls in love with somebody else, just decides they want to sow some wild oats, then it's the church's responsibility to do what Jesus instructed us to do in Matthew 18, and to face that brother or that sister with their sin and go through the process of church recovery, church discipline that Jesus outlines. David, I gave you the last word here, but I agree with you. When Mike McManus said Most people think that husbands, the men, initiate divorces. That is not true. The bulk of divorces are initiated by the women in the relationship, and that may make it tougher for a pastor to kind of move in and deal with that situation, but he's just got to suck it up and do what the scriptures and what his Lord directs him to do to save that marriage and save that family.
Well, Brian, thank you for making those comments. I would encourage pastors that to counsel women, if you leave your marriages or if the men leave their marriages, they should stay single and celibate and make that no uncertain terms, because it is killing the church. It's killing our kids who are looking at their parents going, why are our problems bigger than God?
Yes. All right. Well, very good, David. Listen, I appreciate that. Appreciate that appeal. That's a very, very good word. And, you know, if the church won't get serious about dealing with the issue of divorce, why would we expect our legislators to do that? If the church is not going to get serious about it, then why should we expect people in our legislatures and halls of power, why should we expect them to take divorce reform, marriage reform seriously? So I think that is clearly on the responsibility of the church. The reality is we cannot stop people from getting divorces. If they're going to pursue an unbiblical divorce, we can't stop them. There are no legal impediments any longer to them getting an unbiblical divorce. But the only thing we can do is make decisions about how we as their fellow believers, as their brothers and sisters, how we as their church family, how we are going to respond to that. Are we going to appeal to them, confront them, challenge them, appeal to them to make a righteous choice, or are we going to capitulate, say nothing, roll over, and enable unrighteousness and allow this leaven to come into the midst of our church? Once you accept one unbiblical divorce, then you have to accept them all, and pretty soon a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. Focal Point A for Talk, back after the news.